All right, let's get right into it. Today we're looking at a pretty wild historical theory from the book How the British Invented Communism by Richard Poe. Now, Poe is a New York Times bestselling author, and his argument basically flips the entire script on the Russian Revolution.
So our story really kicks off with a bombshell. It's 1920, and Winston Churchill, who was Britain's Secretary of War at the time, writes this article. And in it, he blames the entire Russian Revolution on a worldwide conspiracy of what he called international Jews. It's just a shocking claim, especially when you remember this is the same guy who would later lead the charge against the Nazis.
And that really raises the central question of the book we're exploring. Why would Churchill say something so extreme? Was there another motive? The author suggests this wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark, it was a very calculated move. According to Poe, Churchill's article was actually a sophisticated piece of misdirection. He argues it was a cover-up, designed to create a scapegoat and point the finger anywhere else, to hide Britain's own role in engineering the whole revolution from the start. Now get this. As evidence, the author presents this quote from Princess Olga Pauli, who was part of the Russian royal family. In 1922, she wrote that the British embassy itself was the nerve center, the hotbed of propaganda, where the decision was made to overthrow her cousin, the Tsar. So, okay, why? What was the motive? Why would Britain do something so drastic? The book argues it had nothing to do with ideology. It was really the final move in a massive geopolitical blood feud that had been going on for centuries. And this feud had a name, the Great Game. It was this shadowy, long-running struggle between the British and Russian empires for control over Asia and really for global dominance. And you can see the pattern so clearly on this timeline. For literally hundreds of years, Britain's main foreign policy goal was to keep Russia contained. They absolutely could not let the Russian Navy get access to a warm water port like Constantinople. That would have let them into the Mediterranean, and that would have challenged British sea power. And they did everything to stop it, from threats of war to outright invasion. And this quote from Queen Victoria herself just lays it all bare. She saw it as a zero-sum game. This wasn't about some small regional dispute. For her, it was a battle for supremacy in the world. Only one empire could be on top.
Now, here is where it gets really interesting. The author claims this rivalry didn't even stop when Britain and Russia were allies during World War I. Publicly, the goal was to defeat Germany, but secretly, the alleged goal was to make sure that even if they won, Russia would be too weak to gain anything from the victory.
Which brings us to the next big question. If Britain wanted to neutralize its own ally, how on earth could they pull that off? Well, the book claims they used a secret weapon they had been perfecting for more than a century. I mean, just think about that for a second. How do you orchestrate the collapse of a massive empire like Russia? Not with an invading army, but with chaos from the inside out. The book calls this weapon the color revolution. Now, we think of that as a modern term, right? But the author argues that it's a very old British technique, a coup planned and managed by foreign intelligence, but carefully disguised to look like a spontaneous grassroots uprising. And here's the alleged playbook. See, it's not about winning over the masses. It's a top-down operation. You patiently infiltrate and compromise the key pillars of the state, the military, the police, the intelligence agencies. Because, as the author claims, a revolution can only succeed when the very people in charge of stopping it simply decide to step aside and let it happen. So this leads us to some of the most startling claims in the entire book, which tie this grand theory directly to the founding fathers of communism. The author makes the case that Leon Trotsky, the military mastermind of the Bolshevik coup, was actually a British asset. He points to this incredible story from 1917 when Trotsky was on his way to Russia and got arrested in Canada. He was held in a camp until, out of nowhere, an order came down from the head of British intelligence, MI6, to set him free. But he gets even crazier. The book argues that Karl Marx himself ended up serving British imperial interests. It talks about this close alliance he formed with David Urquhart, a fanatically anti-Russian Scottish aristocrat and spy, and supposedly together they churned out anti-Russian propaganda that, while it sounded revolutionary, just so happened to perfectly align with Britain's goal of weakening its biggest rival. So how did all these alleged plots and agents come together? The author argues the ultimate goal was achieved by making sure Russia didn't just leave the war, but that it collapsed into a brutal civil war that it would take decades to recover from. The book lays it out as a 1, 2, 3 punch. First, a top British diplomat, Lord Milner, allegedly helps trigger the initial revolution that gets rid of the Tsar. Then, the British ambassador basically acts like a dictator, directing the new democratic government. And then comes the killer move. British intelligence allegedly backs a failed military coup, knowing it would fatally weaken the government and leave the door wide open for the Bolsheviks to just walk in and take power.
And here's the final brutal twist in this whole theory. The author argues that Britain's last move was to make sure that the most extreme faction, the Bolsheviks, won the civil war that followed. And the cold, hard logic was that a communist Russia would be an international outcast, economically destroyed, totally isolated, and no threat whatsoever to the British Empire.
And the cost of that alleged strategy? An estimated 10 million lives. That's how many people died in the Russian Civil War, most of them civilians. It is just a staggering human price for a geopolitical chess move. So we're left with this huge question. Does this thesis represent a hidden history of the 20th century? The author, Richard Poe, certainly thinks so. He argues that the true story of the Russian Revolution, the one we've just walked through, has been intentionally buried for more than 100 years.